Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video. As you've probably guessed from the title, and if you haven't guessed by that, well, there's two people on the screen, so you can guess by that as well. We have a special guest and more of a returning special guest. So I managed not to scare him off last time. So we have the esteemed Vincent O'Hara, author of many, many books. And this week, we're going to be talking about another part of World War II, for which he has, of course, written a book. Although I suppose last time we were talking about the Mediterranean, and this also technically takes place within the Mediterranean.
Technically, there's quite a bit that happens in the Atlantic off the coast of Morocco as well.
Yes.
I like to say that the naval battle of Casablanca was the largest air, land, sea battle ever fought in the Atlantic in World War II. And so people don't associate French-American battle as being the largest, but there it is.
No, and so from that, you can probably guess we're going to be talking about Operation Torch. But just before we get into that, for the benefit of those few people who haven't already seen the video we did about the Mediterranean, would you like to give yourself a quick introduction so they know who you are?
Oh, sure, Drew. Thank you very much. My name is Vincent O'Hara. I'm an independent naval historian located in Southern California. I have written books about I started off writing about surface warfare in World War II. That was my obsession through the 70s and 80s. And I was able to publish 3 books about that with Naval Institute. And very fascinating topic, naval warfare, in my opinion. So I guess that's natural. Torch is a topic. I wrote a book in 2015, published by Naval Institute, Torch, North Africa and the Allied Path to Victory. And in some respects, I consider it my best book. I'm very fond of it. It's a topic that just keeps on giving. There's so much that happened with Operation Torch. Its importance is so great. Its details so interesting, but the knowledge of it so little that I found that it's something people know very little about, and it surprises me.
Yeah, and because I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? A lot of the time, if you think about the pop culture history of amphibious landings in World War II, at the very crude level, you'll hear people talking about maybe Dunkirk as an amphibious evacuation, and then it somehow goes from there to D-Day. And then I guess the next level, people maybe talk about Dieppe or Operation Husky, etc. And a lot of the time, if you ask people to list the amphibious operations of World War II, that's probably about as far as you'll be lucky to get. Everyone seems to forget Torch.
Operation Torch. I think there's reasons for that. I think one of the reasons is that people are a little uncomfortable associating the United States and Great Britain with conducting a invasion of a neutral country, because that in effect is what it was. The French state was neutral in 1942. We think of it in our heads as being a collaborationalist regime controlled by the Germans, and that attacking the French in North Africa was the same as attacking the Germans. Well, this is very far from the truth. And I think one of the fascinating aspects about Operation Torch, an aspect that has gotten very little coverage over time, is the whole role of France in that operation. And believe me, it's complicated, because you have all these different tiers of a feeling amongst the French themselves, the Pétain cult, the people who were actually collaborators, the people who hated the Germans and wanted to get back into the war. And all these different strata are not very well known here. And I think that whole mix of different conflicting motivations and motives has made Torch really a difficult subject for a lot of people. And I include the French in that too, because I think France still has a little bit of trouble confronting their World War II history and accepting the fact that the people who acted on behalf of the French state in 1942, the Vichy French, for example, were still patriots. We're still people who loved France more than anything else and believed in France, but were loyal to the legitimate government of France as well, which happened to be Marshal Pétain.
Yeah, I suppose it's as you said, it's somewhat easier for us to look back on things because apart from the fact that the Allies won, it's somewhat easier to say, well, of course we were on the right side, but for everybody who wasn't Britain, America, or I suppose Russia, it's a lot more complicated to try and put yourself in where you stand.
Well, it's just context. When you're looking at naval history, context is the whole story. I think it's important to be able to put yourself in the position of people at that time. I look at our current situation. We were talking about masks a little bit earlier. How we're in the middle of a pandemic. In 5 years from now, people will say, "Oh, well, that pandemic was no big deal. You know, it was this, it was that." So living in the middle of an event is much different than looking at that event several years or several decades after the fact. And I think Operation Torch really belongs to that category. I think that if you appreciate the degree of risk that was involved in that operation, the uncertainty, the fact that nobody knew what they were doing, the chances they took to pull off that operation were just mind-boggling. I mean, stupendous risks that they took, and I can't imagine any military in the 20th century taking equivalent risks. I just can't do that. And you take all these things and you put them together and you have Operation Torch, and you peel away the layers of it and you look at it and you go, wow, wow, wow. And Torch was what made Husky possible. It was what made the landings in France possible. It's what made D-Day possible. I think if it hadn't been for Operation Torch, and even though the operation was in some respects a failure, even though it was a failure, I think that it kind of laid the foundation for victory over the Germans, because, you know, after the evacuations at Dunkirk, I mean, if Germany was to be defeated, the first step in that defeat had to take place on a beach. You know, you had to come across the sand in order to beat Germany. And the first sand they came across happened to be in Algeria and Morocco. Should have been in Tunisia, but it wasn't. It's in Algeria and Morocco.
So I suppose that kind of we've talked a little bit about what was already in our first scheduled question, which I suppose let's expand on that a little bit. So we've mentioned a little bit about what's interesting about Operation Torch, but also what's more information about why is it a topic that deserves so much attention?
Well, I think the first thing that fascinated me about Torch, you know, coming to this subject, I had this picture in my brain of the Anglo-Americans being almost one unit. You know, they cooperated, they fought together, they were very effective in their collaboration. But the story of how that collaboration came to be effective in some respects is also the story of Torch. The Americans had one vision on how to beat Germany. The British had quite a different vision. And I can go back into the strategy of what those visions were. But it's probably too much time to do that. But just to say that the Americans thought that we should land in France at the heart of German strength, take on the Germans, defeat them. You know, it's kind of like the bloody road to Richmond or the Castillo, the Chapultepec type of approach. You slam them in their chest. The British had a different approach. They had a history of standing offshore, influencing events through blockade, through continental allies, you know, where are the Austrians, where are the Russians, where are the Prussians, and not engaging a mass army in Europe. They did that in 1916, and I think the majority of the opinion would hold that was a mistake, and it probably was. It's hard to say. So they had a different vision, and the British wanted to come at it peripherally. The Americans wanted to come at it directly. Big conflict. The Americans thought they had an agreement to hold Operation Roundup in 1943, Operation Sledgehammer in 1942, landing in Bataan Peninsula. These were all operations that the Americans advocated. The British, no. The Americans thought that the British had agreed to all these things in March 1942. They hadn't. They thought they were unfeasible. When it turned out that the Americans wanted to actually do it, you know, start shipping troops to Britain, et cetera, the British said, "Hey, just a second here. You know, we weren't serious about 1942 France. You know, it's an act of war that what did Churchill say? No admiral, general, no air marshal regards as being a feasible act of war. You know, so Americans are shocked. They have to fight the Germans in 1942 for political reasons. Roosevelt had promised Molotov in May 1942 that there would be a second front. So you have a political imperative and the military imperative in the two conflict. So Torch is the child of that conflict, and I find that very fascinating as well. They met in July. They hammered out a compromise. Roosevelt said, I don't care where you land, just come up with an agreement. It could be Norway, it could be North Africa, it could be France. I don't care. Churchill would have gone for Norway in a second, but not his chiefs of staff. And the Americans agreed with the British in that one. Nobody wanted to invade Norway except for Churchill. Yeah. And Torch was the result. They made the decision on, I think, July 24th. The first plans came out in September. They designated the commander, Eisenhower, in August. It was so rushed. The ships that were to participate in Torch, some of those ships, Massachusetts being one, were not even yet in commission. They were working up, but they were not even in commission yet. So very rushed, very no template for it. There was a lot of bitter feelings amongst the Americans about being manipulated once again by the wily British and being forced to follow their strategies and philosophies. And that's probably a testimony to good staff work. The British were very good at that. Americans were not so great, at least in that instance. And so I find that those aspects of Torch to be kind of fascinating. Then you have a junior American general being put in command of all this stuff. Alan Brooks said, the first time I met Eisenhower, if anybody had told me the future that lay before him, I would not have believed them. He's just some guy from Kansas. But he turned out to be a genius choice. He was able to get along with everybody. He was able to integrate Army and Air Force and naval components together. He was able to integrate different nations together, the British and the Americans. And just to give you a little bit of perspective on Eisenhower's talent, General Hewitt and General Patton, two Americans, were cooperating on the Moroccan landings. They couldn't get along at all. They couldn't even meet together. And they had to, the Navy tried to get Patton fired because they said he was just too non-cooperative. So the Americans had much more difficulty working together than, with themselves than the British and the Americans did with Eisenhower directing it. So I give a lot of credit to Eisenhower on this whole affair. I was no big Ike fan until I started researching Torch, and afterwards I said, that's the guy had talent. The guy had some genius. So that's another aspect of Torch I find interesting. I find it interesting about how they just rushed the preparations. I mean, they had landing transports being launched, being crewed with raw recruits, getting in maybe like 6 or 7 hours over 2 days of rehearsals, lowering their boats. That's all they had time to practice. They loaded those transports with soldiers and sent them off to Africa. It's like 2 days of training. Come on. So that's another aspect of Torch. It's so rushed. You have all these tools that are brand new. You don't even know how they work. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And this is before we even set sail.
Yeah, I suppose that's going to lead to a few things going wrong at some point.
One or two. The history of amphibious operations in World War II, Allied operations, I should say, not Japanese operations, not German operations, because the Germans had some pretty amazing successes, and so did the Japanese. But the Allied record of amphibious operations up until Operation Torch was not particularly good. The only multi brigade landing that was successful was at Madagascar against zero opposition, at least on the beaches. Yeah, they landed at night as one result of the fiasco at Dakar in 1940, September 1940.
Yeah,
which in some respects is a similar type of operation. You have a binational operation composed of free French or fighting French, if you want to call them that, and the British bringing battleships and carriers into a French port, thinking it was going to be an easy walkover. The French tried to land. They were scared off by shore fire. I think one 37mm gun defeated one landing attempt. The French eventually torpedoed a battleship. The French submarine torpedoed a British battleship, Resolution. and that scuttled the whole operation. So that was a major event. And if Dakar had fallen in 1940, that would have changed the course of the war. It would have secured the North Atlantic to a much greater degree. It would have given air coverage. So it was an important event, and the British failed doing it.
There was even
question.
There was even a French battleship there. So
that's right. You have a couple exchanges of gunfire, although Richelieu didn't do that much in the battle. She had her troubles, but yeah, a very interesting operation, and it kind of foreshadows Operation Torch to a little bit. And you have to realize that just going ashore and intimidating the French, there's a history of that, and it didn't work. It didn't work in Dakar in 1940. It didn't work off Syria in 1941. You're familiar with the destroyer actions fought off the coast of Syria. And the French did quite well. The French were able to defend themselves quite effectively. And so there's a lot of feeling amongst the French, particularly the French Navy, against the British because of some of this history of aggression or of conflict, if you will. And the fact that, I haven't even talked about Mers el-Kébir, where the British Navy attacked the French. You have an episode on that, I've noticed. And
yes.
It's one of my favorite what ifs in World War II. I mean, I still can't understand why the British did that, but they did.
Yeah, it's a complicated mess. No one trusts anyone else, and then everything explodes.
Yeah. Well, you read, the New York Times saying, well, the British have demonstrated that they're determined, and, you read, Keanu's diary, say, oh, the British acting like pirates again. So it kind of served a purpose in impressing people that there was a resolution. I see that, but I'm not sure that momentary other ways to demonstrate determination.
Yeah,
less costly, I think.
Yeah.
But by the way, I was at Mers el-Kébir. I was able to go there for the 75th anniversaries of Operation Torch and look down, and that place has changed hardly at all. You look at the photographs from 1940, you look at it today, and pretty much the same.
Okay.
Except for the warships are much smaller.
Yes. Yeah. Less pretty as well these days, I think.
I think there was a Algerian corvette and some sort of replenishment ship.
Yeah.
That was all. It was empty.
Empty. Yeah. I suppose we're landing on ostensibly French soil at this point, and you've got the Pétain government. So what's going on with them? What's their attitude? Because you've got obviously Pétain is back in France, but you've also got Darlan, who's actually physically there, who is also probably, as a result, Mers el-Kébir not exactly the biggest fan of the British.
Historians paint Darlan as being Anglophobic, and they say that he was deadly insulted because he was in 1938 or whatever. He was seated behind a pillar at some event in London, and this, that, and the other. I think the one characteristic that the French leadership, from Pétain to Darlan to Naval, the whole crew, the one thing they share in common that struck me was a great love for France. They were all French patriots. The way that patriotism expressed itself is a different fashion, is a different thing. And I look at a nation of such accomplishment and such pride, and I imagine going through the situation being utterly defeated by the Germans. I mean, talk about trauma, talk about national trauma. I can't even imagine it. So, naturally, this national trauma expressed itself in far differing opinions amongst people. I mean, Darlan didn't like the Germans, didn't like the British particularly, didn't like the Germans, Americans, and he liked the French, and that's what you expect. That's his mission, that's his job. Pétain was no fan of the Germans. You know that Pétain hated the Germans, but he's in a situation where he's the savior of France. He's bringing the French back to a new moral order. He's an 84-year-old general, and his views of society are pretty conservative, as you can imagine. And he wanted to emphasize family, work, and religion. That was his thing. This is an opportunity for him to remoralize France. Okay, that's where he's coming from. Some of the command in Africa, General Juan and General Mast. Mast was a member of the conspiracy against the government. He was a rebel. Juan was not a rebel. He was loyal to Pétain, but he, given the slightest opportunity, he jumped over to the Americans. On the other hand, you had Frenchmen, if they were ordered to fight, they fought. And you look at the Navy. Port Loyalty, nobody ever talks about that. That's the northern landing in Morocco. They were landing up there in order to secure an airbase. Well, the French commander had a diary. He left a diary, and he got the news that there was going to be a coup d'etat, and that the Americans were landing, and all the officers in his regiment had a party. They were happy. They were fantastic news. And then a courier arrived from Rabat saying, "Oh, no. This is a conspiracy. Pétain orders us to fight." So with a sad heart, he rallies his troops, they fight. Well, they fought so effectively, they drove the Americans back to the beachhead, on the first day. So this is people who are pro-American, but they obey orders, and they're professional soldiers, commanding French Foreign Legion and other African troops. So the troops were not insignificant. The troops were not, they were not idiots. So this kind of explains the different receptions that the Americans and the British got on the different beaches. But when the French were told to fight, they fought.
Yeah, and I suppose that I know we were discussing when we spoke before about the Mediterranean. We were discussing about a lot of the sort of the myths that have grown up about World War II, and I suppose that's another one of them, isn't it? Because of the rather rapid collapse of France in 1940, people sometimes get the impression that the French troops weren't really up to all that much and would fold at the drop of a hat. But turns out not so much.
Not so much. The colonel who commanded the 47th regiment that landed at Safi, which was the southern Moroccan landing points, he spoke French. He had been educated militarily. The French were the French were his gods. He fought in World War I. He respected the French. I mean, the American commanders looked at the French through the lenses of World War I. The French were the victorious victors. They conquered Germany in that war. So there was a lot of respect for the French at that time, which maybe post-war, due to the mythologies that you were talking about, kind of got erased.
Yeah, and so I suppose that kind of puts us in the context of what's going on, sort of who's lined up on either side. But then when everyone's thinking, okay, so we've decided we're going after Vichy France rather than, I don't know, the Atlantic coast or the Channel or Norway with Churchill's one vote.
Churchill's one vote. Yeah.
How did they kind of decide we're going to put this operation together? What's kind of the overview of what they're actually thinking in terms of how they're going to go about this now they've decided what the target is?
Well, the first limitation was shipping. You don't know how many transports you have, which determines how big each landing can be. You don't know how many landing craft you have, which determines how many troops you can actually carry to the beach. You don't know how many escorts you have, which determines how many task forces you can run across. So Eisenhower, who was in charge of the planning, he complains bitterly about how he had to do all these things. He had to please two different masters, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff and the British Chiefs of Staff Committee, and they were not on the same page. When they were talking about Sledgehammer, which was an emergency landing in France with 3 American and 7 British divisions, the British said this will never happen because there's too much risk and the Germans will come and kick us out. When we're talking about landing in the Mediterranean, the Americans were suddenly very nervous because they had most of the troops. They didn't want to land too deep inside the Mediterranean because they were afraid that the Spanish would suddenly become difficult and take Gibraltar, as if well, you know that the British were completely controlling Spanish imports,
Yeah.
and Spain was not producing enough food to feed themselves.
And I mean, I've recently been to Gibraltar and gone through all the tunnels and the fortifications, and I pity anybody whose job it was to attack that place.
Yeah, well, German paratroopers and mountain troops might be one thing, but I can't imagine Spanish troops pulling it off. No disrespect to Spain whatsoever at all, but they just weren't trained or equipped to do that. So you had the Americans being nervous about sailing too far into the Mediterranean, and so they wanted to take Morocco and secure their lines of communication back across the Atlantic. The British said, "That's nuts. That's crazy. Why on earth do you want to do that? There's no danger from Spain. If we don't take Tunis, the Germans will. And if they take Tunis, maybe they'll take Algiers." So the British were properly attuned to the need to land as far to the east as possible. The Americans wanted to land at Oran and Morocco only, which just would not have done the trick. The first the first plan that Eisenhower came out with under heavy British influence was to land in Bone, which is on the very border between Tunisia and Algeria, and Algiers and Oran, much further to the east. So there's a big controversy about this, big disagreement. And to make a very, very, very long story short, eventually they compromised, as they had to do repeatedly. They compromised with Eisenhower as a general. They compromised with the objectives. They had to compromise with the cities they were going to land at within that operation. They picked Morocco because the Americans wanted Morocco. They picked Oran, and they picked Algiers. They made a special arrangements to land at Algiers. And they were going to follow up with subsequent landings at Bone and then paratroopers in Tunis 3 days after the landing. And if this had happened, the objective was to take all of North Africa by the end of November. So this is the objective. This includes Tunisia. You have to remember, November 1942 was also a very important month on the other end of the Mediterranean, where the British won the victory at El Alamein, which I think began on October 23rd. And they didn't, what day was the breakthrough? The breakthrough wasn't until, 4th or 5th November, I think, somewhere in there. Anyway, I could look it up. So you have all this happening on the other side of the Mediterranean. This is very important to the British. Malta is in the process of starving. It needs a convoy, but bad, because the August convoy, that magnificent crash through of supplies, and Operation Pedestal, was actually a failure, and not enough supplies actually got through. So if Malta didn't get a convoy in November, it was time to start killing the draft animals and eating horse meat. And don't want that to happen. They had some gasoline. They were hoarding it for the convoy. Malta could not help at all. So is my point here. So they pick on these three destinations. The Americans thought that if we come ashore without the British, the French will welcome us because we're Americans.
Yeah. We haven't actively attacked them yet.
No. There's some sort of fantasy going on in Roosevelt's mind about the relationship between France and Britain, as far as I can tell. And they actually expected that they could come ashore without fighting in certain cases. They worked very hard to make that happen. They had a conspiracy, like I said, with General Mast, and I think the head of the Casablanca division as well, being in support of this conspiracy. They arranged it for certain beaches there was no resistance. At the British beach in Algiers, in fact, the far western beach, the unit had been in Syria. It was manning that beach, and they were very anti-British. And the commander told them to stand down, and they did stand down. So that's probably the most important example of the conspiracy actually helping the landing. Because if there had been resistance, those guys would have resisted. And apparently they almost rebelled because they had to stand down. So so anyway, so we're talking about the landings themselves. They come up with a compromise, 3 places to come ashore. Well, within Morocco, there's 3 separate landings, and then in Algiers, 3 separate landings, and in Oran, 3 separate landings. The idea was to surround the cities and hope for French resistance to kind of evaporate, and move on to Tunis. Job done. And we can do round up in 1943, and we defeat the Germans in 43, and job done. And it didn't work out that way, for various reasons. But that was the idea. That was the idea.
Yeah, and I suppose, yeah, when they start the landings, how much are they surprised by the fact that the French actually start fighting back?
Well, that's a good question. I think that excuse me. I think that the reactions varied from beachhead to beachhead. I think that in the beginning they were so focused on trying to get ashore. They were so focused. They were. It was in Morocco anyway. It was kind of a stormy day. It was rainfall. The visibility wasn't that great. You're anchoring 6 to 8 miles offshore. You're getting into a 8 to a 10 knot boat, 30 men cramming into a little boat. 10 knots, well, that's about a couple hours journey, shore. All dark, you can't see a thing. It's kind of drizzling and raining. You have inexperienced boatsmen trying to follow their compasses. So I think the initial concentration was to get ashore. The only time they had gunfire was at Fidala, the central Moroccan landing, got shore batteries. In fact, Yellow Beach at Fidala, I think, was the only landing the Allies made in World War II where they actually the landing was defeated by gunfire from warships offshore. That took place after daybreak. But that's a nice trivia fact. I think if you name a single amphibious operation the Allies did where enemy warships interfered with it, that's the only time I can think of.
Okay.
So everything happened there. They had shore batteries firing at them. They had warships firing at them. They had soldiers meeting on the beaches. They had soldiers staying inside their barracks. It was kind of a mixture of everything. But I think the biggest enemy was actually getting ashore and getting across the sand in the beginning. I mean, there was one beach in Oran, where they had ridges in the sand. If you probably not a beach person, but Ocean Beach, a couple miles away, we have places where the sand gets scooped out. So you're walking and suddenly you're over your head. Then you're walking, you're ankle deep, and you're over your head again. And this happened to some American vehicles. They landed, they beached, come off, and
disappeared.
The landing craft, especially in some of the Moroccan beaches, especially Fidala, they ran into rocks. They were supposed to land in a tight package about 1.5 miles across. But 20 miles this way, 20 miles that way was actually 40 miles that they landed in. And the extreme outliers were just 1 or 2 boats, but the landings were messed up. They came ashore in the wrong places, all over the place, lost a lot of boats in the initial landings. Most people made it, nobody died, but it was a mess. And that really affected the subsequent landings. So places where there was not much resistance, this made a big deal. This was really important because you have confused, disoriented troops on shore, and if they were being attacked, like at Port Lauti, what happens? They get pushed back. If there's no attack, they can organize and come ashore fine. So there's a little mix of everything. Some beaches were dangerous. Some beaches took casualties. Some beaches was just to walk ashore and organize and drive on. It was every beach was different, and there were 9 of them. So and I would love to talk about all 9 individually, but I will not do that to you. I will not do that to you.
maybe when all the travel restrictions have eased up, we can go over there and do a walking tour of 1 or 2 of them.
It was kind of funny because we went to one beach in Algiers, for some sort of ceremony. They had all these Algerian bigwigs. They had these generals, and they had all tons of brass, right? And ambassadors. They had like 9 different ambassadors, and they were going to set up a little speaking thing on the beach, and have speeches and throw wreaths and do all that stuff. And suddenly the rain started coming down. Suddenly there was lightning on the beach, and so then we got to see the diplomatic corps of Algiers scramble to arrange for an alternative venue, which they did, but it happened indoors. My point is you never know what happens on a beach, you know, and we didn't expect lightning that day, that's for sure.
Yeah. And I suppose, actually, speaking of unexpected things in the naval history aspect of things, poor old USS Ranger tends to get a lot of stick, because as an aircraft carrier, the US Navy looks at her and just goes, yeah, we'd kind of like to forget she ever existed, to the point that when they're running out of carriers in the Pacific, they'd rather take a British carrier, HMS Victorious, in than bring Ranger into the equation. And yet at Torch, Ranger is kind of the big air support unit there. So
Ranger was in her glory at Torch. Ranger was the guy, if you will, and they were happy to have her. And you know, the air support she provided was important. I think the Americans were lucky that the resistance collapsed within 3 days in Morocco. Thanks to Admiral Darwin, but that's a different story. I talk about the political, but Ranger, Ranger never had a better day than she did November 8th. That was the height of her career.
Yeah, she got to be the big fleet carrier that she never was allowed to be otherwise.
Yeah, and she did okay. She was never threatened. She was adequate for the job. You know, she carried enough aircraft to make a difference. The escort carriers, some of the escort carriers had no experience whatsoever. Sagama, I think, in Safi, she lost her entire air group within 1 day. I mean, just by accidents, and they tried to. I think she was down to, like, exact number escapes, you know, 6 or 7 aircraft after just, you know, 1 day's operations.
Operational attrition.
Yes.
Yeah. I suppose that kind of segues into another thing we were going to look at, is, you know, so there's Ranger, the carrier that nobody wanted, having the best time of her life. But were there some other sort of odd things about this operation, strange facts or aspects that you think you'd like to mention with regard to Torch?
Yeah, before we leave Ranger, I'd like to talk about Massachusetts a little bit, because Massachusetts, you know, was a battleship, and she was the brawn, if you will, for the Casablanca landings, and thank God she was there, because she actually had to fight. And I find it interesting looking at the career of Massachusetts, for example. She was laid down, and she was brought into service very, very quickly. You know, she was laid down far before Tirpitz, for example. And her working up period, she was still working up, basically that whole entire operation was her workup period. And the fact that a brand new battleship with 2,100 sailors, of whom 80% were brand new, you know, 30% of our officers had never been to sea before. And you see a ship like this, and the philosophy that brings it into action so quickly. You contrast that with the Germans, who would, they took like 8 months preparing a submarine for operations, for God's sakes. And how long was Tirpitz working up for? You know, a year and a half or so. Some I think that's too long, but some very long period of time. And so she gets there, and the way she used might be questioned. We might wonder why the French were able to bring an entire destroyer squadron out of a harbor under the guns of American battleship and cruisers. How were they able to do this? How were they able to survive for 4 hours, sailing back and forth, threatening the landings, you know, returning, threatening the landings? You have Massachusetts bombarding the harbor, bombarding French destroyers. You have American heavy cruisers and light cruisers doing the same thing. But the battle keeps on going on and on and on. You have French submarines missing Massachusetts, missing Tuscaloosa, missing Brooklyn, by not very much. And you remember Dakar, where a British battleship was torpedoed.
Yeah.
What would have happened if a couple of those torpedo attacks had worked? I don't think it would have defeated the landing, but it certainly would have raised the Americans' appreciation of the threat level quite a bit. And I just look at all these events and all these close calls that were happening, and I just think to myself, what right does a brand new battleship have to be able to be so effective? How is it possible she was able to hit moving targets at 28,000 yards? Take that, war fight. Well, seriously, she sank Milan at 28,000 yards, and she did it not just once; she did it with another ship as well. So it's kind of like, I just look at that, and she wasn't using radars, and she knocked all her radars out with the concussions, in the first couple of minutes of action. This is all eyeballing it. Impressive stuff. Impressive stuff. So I kind of have to give the U.S. Navy a kudo or two, saying, being able to bring relatively new force, untrained force, and apply it. And I know the French are not the Germans, but when you're talking navies, that's not a bad thing. I mean, the French Navy never had to be ashamed of its performance in anything it did, I think, during World War II. So they were fighting a real foe in a real situation and doing it very effectively. And the stakes were very, very, very high. Having said that, if you're familiar with the battle, Massachusetts, comes from 30,000 yards away. The French get out of harbor because she's 15 miles away, far to the south, doing who knows what. Comes back, chases all the French away, then sails off again, trying to provide against a sortie by Richelieu, which is how far away? 1,200 miles or something, down in Dakar, and never understood that either. So she did this 3 times, which is one of the reasons why the battle was able to last as long as it did.
Yeah,
Admiral Giffen.
And then you have Jean Bart as well, sitting in harbor, taking the occasional pot shot.
7 times. She fires 7 times. She was most effective on the 10th when she was firing at Augusta, when Augusta came in, and almost got hit, much to her surprise, by a 15-inch French shell.
Yeah, it solved the problems that Richelieu had before.
Yeah, well, I guess people on the bridge got soaked in the yellow dye that she used, so it's close enough.
Yeah. So I suppose. So you've got what is the one battleship. You've got one big carrier there. You've got a bunch of smaller ships, and then, as you say, it's a somewhat odd landing, because you think about D-Day or Husky or any of those others, and you're talking about hundreds of ships, multiple capital ships, etc. And then Torch is going off with one of each.
Well, that's just that one landing. You got to remember, every landing site had their own battleship. So you had New York down at Safi, and yet Texas and New York, actually. Texas was up at Port Lyautey. New York was down at Safi, and you had some of the British heavies in the Mediterranean. You had all the modern battleships, your Duke of Yorks and your King Georges, guarding against an intervention by the French fleet, Toulon, or God forbid, the Italians coming in from the north. So there's a lot of different moving parts here. If you take it all together, and if you take all the different moving pieces and consider what they were doing, who they were guarding against, and the large extent of territory they were covering, it's in some respects it's more complicated than D-Day.
So yeah, because I suppose at that point, by the time you get to D-Day, you've got the Kriegsmarines around, but you don't really have to worry about too much intervention, except by maybe small craft at D-Day, because most of the big German units by D-Day no longer exist, and the ones that do are all the way up in Norway. But as you said, is if you've got the Toulon fleet, you've got the Regia Marina, etc., all with some fairly hefty capital ships. So it sounds like with Torch, most of the heavy stuff, instead of being physically there for the landings, it's more of a shield to stop anyone else coming to interfere. So kind of creating not a sandbox, but you're kind of creating a closed environment within which your amphibious forces can do their thing.
Well, it's like, we talked about French politics a little bit, but the German and Italian politics that were going on at this very same time were also pretty fascinating. So you have the Germans trying to encourage the French to declare war on the British and the Americans. which is, the normal response in a situation like that. So you have Pierre Lavelle, who is the despised cigarette smoking French prime minister who had the audacity to blow smoke in Pétain's face, et cetera, et cetera. The collaborationist, the guy that everybody loves to hate, going to meet Hitler in Germany. So how does he go? How does he travel from Vichy to Germany to meet Hitler? He takes a car, doesn't fly. I guess he's not in that much of a hurry, is he? Gets to Germany. Hitler receives him. Hitler basically says, if you declare war, you're a member of the Axis. In other words, all the prisoners go home. Because don't forget, there's still 1.3 million Frenchmen being held prisoner in Germany. They say every German farm had its Frenchman. It was true. So you have Pierre Lavelle getting an implied offer, to be fair to him, of total collaboration and membership. All of his goals would be realized. Prisoners come home, borders are restored. The Germans will evacuate everything except for Alsace-Lorraine. All you got to do is declare war on the Americans, the British. And what does Lavelle try to do? He tries to negotiate. So Hitler goes to the other room, orders the invasion of France, and says, okay, bye. So that didn't happen. So my point is the French had the opportunity, if they wanted to join the Axis at that point as a full member. And you say, well, what's the big deal with that? Who cares? But if in 1944, for example, if the Americans and the British had been facing 30 or 40 or 50 French divisions guarding the beaches in France, that would changes the force equation just a little bit.
Yeah, well, and if nothing else, the German troops that were otherwise occupied dealing with Vichy France and occupying it wouldn't have been there. They would have been available for North Coast defense.
Yeah, and so this is important stuff for me. I think it's part of the story that's very important. But having said that, the French Admiral de la Borde, because we were talking about the necessity to guard against naval interventions, that was our topic. Remember, de la Borde was dying to sortie and take on the Allies. He wanted to do it. He was going to take his cruisers. He was going to leave the battleship. But he had a sortie all set out because they did not have unlimited fuel either. And you read a comment in the diary of the Italian High Command. They said they thought it was going to happen. They go, "Oh, I can't believe it. The French are going to join us. We've won the war." So that's how they were thinking at the time. They thought that this was a moment of opportunity as well as a threat. And don't forget that the Germans, again, thought that the Allied invasion was an opportunity for them to win a major victory. So, and one other point I want to make about this is that French waffling. The French, I make it sound like the French didn't really want to join the Germans, and they didn't. But they wanted to keep the facade of legitimacy. And their whole goal was to keep the Germans out of unoccupied France, which they failed in. But Darlan joined the Allies the first day, November 8th. In Morocco, they joined the Allies after 2 days, on the 10th, following Darlan's orders. In Tunisia, the army commander wanted to join the Allies. The Navy commander, the Supreme Commander, didn't. And so that's why the Germans were able to come in. They landed a couple of airplanes on an airfield with some security personnel aboard. They were faced by French armored cars and machine guns. The French could have eradicated them right there and then at that point, but they didn't. And so the Germans were able to establish a bridgehead. And in what I like to call one of the greatest naval defeats that the Allies suffered during World War II, they permitted the Germans and the Italians 2 weeks of peace in order to bring over enough troops to hold Tunisia and turn back the first Allied attempts to seize the city in November 24th or so, somewhere in that neighborhood. So, we're talking about very, very, very fine margins here, and things could have happened any which way you like, depending upon one or two little things. If some soldier had depressed his machine gun trigger and started fireworks at the airport in Tunis, we probably would have been talking about World War One, World War Two being a year shorter, in all
Mm.
honesty. So,
On the smallest of things
yeah,
turns
you
to big
could take
events.
anything,
Yeah.
and do that, but it's in this case, it's true, I think.
Mm.
And it took 2 weeks before they started paying attention to that transit route. The Italians brought over 40 transports in that period, and that made all the difference in the world. So,
Yeah, and I suppose when we're talking about sort of obviously you've got the shield, as we discussed, you've got all these are things going on outside of it, but you mentioned briefly about Massachusetts engaging Milan, and we talked about Massachusetts engaging Jean Bart. How many naval battles were there between the Marine Nationale and the Allied forces within the scope of the landing area?
on November 8th, Iran had a pretty large naval contingent of destroyers and large destroyers. No, Iran, excuse me, they're all fleet destroyers, and they sortied on the 8th. A sloop Surprise was sunk by a British destroyer. Several of the destroyers came out and suffered casualties. They tried it again on the 10th. Same effect. You had I think it was Aurora, the Silver Ghost from Force H, was the British light cruiser shooting up the French. Jamaica was there also, but she wasn't quite as effective. Very, very, very successful ship Aurora was. I think you can make a good point for certain warships having special magic.
Yeah.
In this case, excellent gunnery.
Mm-hmm.
And every time she was in combat, she did very well. So you have destroyer cruiser actions off of Oran. You have the attempts to sail warships into the French harbors, land troops directly on the quays. Excuse me, English pronunciation, on the quays, in order to take the harbors. And these were horribly unsuccessful. I think the most famous one happened at Oran, where you had the two ex-Coast Guard cutters carrying several hundred American troops try to penetrate the harbor. Excuse me. You have a French searchlights come on. British officer goes on the loudspeaker and says, "Do not open fire. Hold your fire. We are Frenchmen. We are Americans." Flying the big American flag. I guess his French accent was atrocious, and that didn't have much of an effect. They slaughtered the Americans, and they sank both the cutters. Tried the same thing in Algiers, lost the destroyer. Tried the same thing at Port Laoti. Took them 3 days to actually penetrate the river. So there was everything you could imagine was happening in Torch. You had a paratroop drop. You had paratroopers dropping on a dry lake outside of Oran, and they took off from Cornwall to conduct a mission in Africa. They flew over Spain illegally, of course, and one plane got lost and had to come down and circle over some lighthouse in Spanish Morocco in order to recognize where they were. Most of the paratroopers didn't make it, but some did. And so things like that were happening, and every landing had something weird going on. Something strange, something extraordinary, something brand new, unprecedented. It's really kind of a textbook example of amphibious operations, of the day after on the beachhead. It's just everything happens in Operation Torch. It's one of the reasons why I find it so fascinating. And before I came on today and yesterday, I was reading my Torch book. I wrote it long enough ago where it's all brand new to me. And I just oh, and it's fascinating. It really is. It's so much happened in that operation that people just do not know about. And I enjoyed researching it immensely. I enjoyed the politics. I enjoyed the operations. I enjoyed, like you said, Ranger. Where did Ranger shine? Operation Torch. The longest naval gunfire hit in World War II. Longest parachute drop in, as far as I know, unless you exclude the Israelis, military history. So all sorts of things were happening. The French, the whole gambit of reactions. Um, it's all there, I think. So if you want one of the best stories of World War II, there it is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so what would you say was sort of the biggest impacts and benefits from Torch, and did it actually succeed in what it was supposed to be doing?
That's a really good question, because in this day and age, we don't even think about Operation Torch. So it's like it just, it's like a dress rehearsal for something important. I think the biggest thing Operation Torch did was it gave the Americans and the British a way to forge a working relationship where they could have an American or a British person command a binational force, where you kind of force your different branches of your military to cooperate together. You have situations where you have American generals ordering the actions of British warships. That's a pretty rare event in anybody's history of warfare. You don't let foreigners give your troops orders.
Yeah.
And so it did that, and it kind of provided a template for the two sides to be able to do these things, see how they work, see what they needed to do to be more effective working together. And I think they reaped the rewards of that cooperation in Operation Husky in Sicily, in the Mediterranean, and in D-Day especially. I think D-Day is all about Operation Torch, and what they learned in Operation Torch, facilitated and made possible even D-Day. It gave the Americans and the British both an important success. I think that at that point in the war, both sides needed to come to grips with their appreciation of the situation in Europe, and part of the danger was that the American public was all for fighting the Japanese. And one of the reasons for that is if you're an American citizen, your child has died in the war, you got a notice from the Department of Defense or about the casualty. Well, he was killed by the Japanese. He wasn't killed by the Germans. And so all the anger, all the hatred was directed there. They had to, elections are coming up. You have to bring the war to Europe. It did that. It brought the war to Europe. It basically set the tempo for what was to happen. I think. So in that respect, I think Operation Torch was one of the most important operations of the war. It taught them they could do what they needed to do in order to win victory. And and some people say, well, how do you fight Germans by invading a neutral country in Africa? The closest Germans are 1,200 miles away. But it did suck in about 100,000 Germans eventually. It did make the defense of it made Montgomery's task a lot easier, because I'm sorry, I think that if there had been no Operation Torch, there would have been another stand around, as happened in 1940.
Yeah, the back and forth yo-yo in the Western Desert.
Yeah, I'm not completely convinced that yo-yo would have been completely eliminated, because all the reinforcements that were supposed to go to Egypt ended up going to Tunisia. So, something else to think about. So, but I think Operation Torch is a subject that it's a little bit off your beaten path in that it's not strictly naval, but it is an amphibious operation. It is the first time a major amphibious operation was used. They had to answer basic questions. How do you get from the ship to the boat? They had rope ladders, they had rope cargo nets, they had chain nets, they had metal ladders. They tried lowering the boats. Loaded, suffered capsizes. So they didn't even know how to do that. There were still questions about how to do that. And all those transports that were brand new and at Torch that had never fought before were seasoned veterans by the time they were operating in the Pacific, which they did.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing. It lays the groundwork, because a lot of these things they're going to be the kind of thing where it might look good on paper, or it might look good in a lab, or it might look good in testing, but you're not necessarily going to know which option works best until you try it out for real.
Yeah. Like, for example, at Madagascar, they sent a destroyer into the port of Diego Suarez and landed 50 commandos. That worked. You go, oh, this is a good technique for taking harbors. Tried it at Torch. Half the Allied casualties, came from that one attempt. They never tried that again. So, it's a bigger stage, and you're doing it more often. LSTs are a good idea. We know that now. They only had 2 of them, but they were very handy, where they were.
Yeah.
How to lay steel matting over a beach so you can make roadways. They did that in D-Day, but they learned that in Torch. So there's a lot of things were happening there that made Torch very important, I think.
Yeah, and it's I suppose it's one of those. I suppose in a lot of ways it's also a turning point, because you've got, I mean, up till that point, you've got the ongoing campaign in Guadalcanal in the Pacific, but that's not been an opposed landing. They've landed and they're fighting on the island, but the Japanese weren't kind of on the coast with bunkers and mortars trying to stop them physically coming in. So this is kind of the first big amphibious operation into the face of, at least in places, opposition fire. So it's kind of I guess it's you could see it in a lot of ways as a turning point, because it's now, rather than say in the Western Desert where you're going back and forth, but you're trying to hold on to what you've got, and Guadalcanal is kind of both sides contesting something that neither had. Here it's something that someone else has, and we are now actively taking it away. So it's in that way, it's kind of almost, it's not quite the beginning of the end, but it shows the way forward for the rest of the war.
We didn't talk about shore battery fire, for example, but every beach in Torch had to face it. It was a big topic there, and it was real. It was dangerous, and they had to deal with it. They learned a lot in the process. And you were talking about that, and I was thinking one other thing that Operation Torch did was it did bring France back into the position, back as an ally. It clarified the position of France, I think. And I think that was important in 1942, because there's still the French Empire. There's still a lot to be gained from being allies with France. So I think Torch did that as well. And I think that the prospect, or the possibility, of France being an Axis nation was perhaps a little bit greater than people at this point in time want to admit. And you're not going to read about it in French histories too much, because it's such a volatile topic, and it still is.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's not something that most people would necessarily want to talk about after the war's end. So I guess at that point, is there anything else you want to bring up about Torch?
Well, I think the only thing I want to bring up about Torch is to stress once again about how very fascinating it is. And thank you for the opportunity to bring me back and let me babble about it a little bit. If you don't mind, let me this just got published last month, I guess, and it's a new thing by Naval History Special Edition. It's kind of like a magazine with a better binding, and Naval Institute's going to be publishing those. Massachusetts covers Operation Torch, so if you want to read about Operation Torch on the quick and dirty, it's one avenue for doing that. And I think it's something that the politics, just the implications on the war itself, grand strategy, the operational aspects, the landings, the naval battles, the assaults on the beachheads, it's all good stuff, and very interesting and very informative and very instructive for how the Allies ended up winning World War II. And in the context of 1942, guess what? A lot of the Axis thought they were winning.
Yeah, that's right. So obviously, if you want to know more about Massachusetts and a quick version of Torch, pick that up. And if you want to know about Torch in more detail, you do have a book that goes into that as well.
I do. Look at that. There it is. Oh, I'm covering my name up. You're not supposed to do that. There you go.
There you go. Yeah, and it's very, very, very well reviewed and very highly rated book as well. So obviously there'll be links to where you can get both of those books down in the description. USNI for those of you in the States, or I guess like myself, if you've got membership overseas, and I'll try and include some of the other places you can get it as well. So definitely encourage you to have a look, have everyone have a look through those and get those books if you haven't done. And obviously we can forgive them for not having the Massachusetts one just yet. It's only just come out.
Yeah, well, I think there's a drive at Naval Institute to try to broaden the interest in naval history in certain aspects. And you get tired of reading about China, the threat from China all the time, and this, that, and the other. And I think they're doing a pretty good job. I think it's something that heavy on the pictures, 120 illustrations, maps, color maps, are wonderful. And
yeah, I must admit, maps, modern color maps that have been somewhat, I wouldn't say sanitized, but made a little bit saner, are something I really enjoy, because I'm sure you found this doing the research into Torch, but some maps you get from the period, you look at it and you think, is someone accidentally slipped me a sheet of Babylonian cuneiform? Because this makes no sense whatsoever.
I don't understand how anybody can write military history or naval history without including lots and lots of maps. Because maps express, so much of it's related to geography, and you can describe geography, but you can picture so much better. And so yeah, I'm on your team. I have very nice atlases of World War II and maps, this, that, and the other, and all my books are profusely mapified.
Yes,
they all have maps. So
yeah, I must admit that, but that's definitely something I appreciate, because a good set of maps in a book helps you, as it helps you make sense of what's going on. So I guess we'll wrap it up there. So once again, thank you very much for coming back on the channel. Hopefully everyone's a bit more educated on what happened in Operation Torch and why we should be looking into it. And if you want to expand your research further, well, now you know where to go to find that out. So I guess we'll say goodbye to everybody else. Hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I've enjoyed recording it. And since he's not throwing things at the screen, I guess Mr. O'Hara doesn't hate me yet either.
No. I actually enjoyed talking to you quite a bit. You're a very interesting and informed person, and the people like that just don't drop out of trees.
Thank you very much.
No, you're great, and I enjoy talking to your audience. I have to comment that I was very pleased that you have such a civil and a congenial group of listeners. I think that says a lot for you as well. The comments were very, very civilized, and I know that sometimes I touch upon topics that people disagree with me, and that's fine. That's good. You should disagree with people, but you can express that civilly. So
yeah, well, I mean, if we
guys do that,
if we all agreed there'd just be one big book of World War II, and then it'll be very boring because we wouldn't have anything else to do.
Yeah, it's true, and it'd be all wrong too, wouldn't it?
Yes, exactly. All right, so we'll wrap up there. Goodbye, everyone, and see you again in another video.
Thank you.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.